On this episode, according to Josh Waitzkin, there are two fundamentally different ways that young chess players are taught. What can this teach us about water-sensitive urban design? Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro, where it's another That's Like WSUD episode, where we take an idea or a concept or a bit of knowledge that we've heard about, read about, or otherwise come across somehow, somewhere in our life, and apply that back to water-sensitive urban design. Now, these episodes tend to come in twos or threes, and that is because we're often inspired by a book or an article that we've been reading or listening to at a time. And one of my favourite books is The Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin. The previous That's Like WSUD episode was about an idea from it, and so is this episode. So Josh was a child chess prodigy. He was tipped to be the next Bobby Fischer, so the next essentially world champion, next dominant American world champion chess player. Now, he never quite fulfilled that expectation that people placed upon him, but he became a master learner and became a world champion in a martial art, and has gone on to do a bunch of really cool other stuff, but fundamentally his skill is how people learn. He is a master learner in a whole bunch of different fields. And something that he describes in The Art of Learning is how when young chess players are taught, there are fundamentally two different ways that they are taught. And by far and away the most common one of these is that they are taught. So chess, obviously being a board game, it has a start and it progresses through the game and it has an end. Is that very many young players are taught to memorize a huge number of openings in chess. So sequences of moves that you play at the beginning of a chess game. And this is really powerful because if you can memorize these really devastating combinations of moves that are tactically really good, and you can play them really well and understand how, oh, if someone counters with that, then I need to do this to maintain the upper hand. If you can memorize those openings really well, then you can set yourself up for great positions and great advantages, and then later on in the game you're so far ahead that even if you're a really clumsy player, you can take the opponent out. So that's one way that young players are taught. But Josh learned a different way, and he was taught a different way, which was he was taught from the absolute basics from the end of the chess game. So chess is a game where each player starts, it's played on an 8x8 board, each player starts with 16 different pieces of like 6-7 different types in combinations, and an end game will often end up with only 3-4 pieces on the board. And the simplest combination of this is for one player to have only their king left and another player to have their king and a pawn left. And so Josh was taught, starting on this fundamental absolute basics, how to play in that situation, king versus king and pawn. And he was taught how to master that and master all the permutations and combinations of what that can throw up and the principles of it. So he wasn't memorizing particular positions or moves or combinations of moves, but he was memorizing the principles that underpin, if they do something that looks like this, then I need to do something that looks like this. Or if I do that, then that's going to lead to that. The principles. And once he'd become comfortable with king versus king and pawn, then it became, for example, king versus king and bishop, king versus king and rook, king versus king versus king, bishop and pawn. These combinations, and gradually built up to be more and more complex until they built back to the beginning of the game. And Josh believes that this is by far and away the most superior way to teach chess. Because for him, what would happen, and he was a very strong chess player, what would often happen was he'd go and play against other kids who'd been taught in the opening sequence first manner. By the way, we are getting to the point that this relates to water-sensitive urban design, but this is going to take a little bit to set up from here. So what would happen for Josh as a young player is that he'd come up against the players who'd learned a whole bunch of really complex opening sequences, and he'd be playing against them. He'd often end up at a little bit of a disadvantage. He'd actually lose the opening maneuvers, so to speak, and come to the mid-game of the chess game. He'd actually be down a few pieces, but because he had this much more fundamental and nuanced understanding, like every chess game, like if you have a mismatch, ooh, my neighbour's mowing, we're going to need to go for a walk so that this mic doesn't pick everything up. Sweet. So, fundamentally, if you have a mismatch and someone has learned from the opening sequence approach to chess, then this is going to be fine because they're going to get so far ahead in the opening sequence that, I'm just finding a little bit of shade to squat in and have a chat here, that they're going to have such an advantage after the opening sequence, that they're just going to dominate from there because there's this mismatch. But when you had a situation where you had one player who was really strong in the opening, and then another player, Josh, who was really strong in the mid and end games because they understood the principles and the complexities, Josh would often go down a little bit in the opening, but every game would get to the mid game, and then he understood it so well, he understood the principles behind it so well, that regardless of the situation, regardless of however many, because there are literally thousands and thousands of opening combinations, you can't possibly memorize them all. Josh was playing on the basis that because he understood the principles, even if he went down a little bit out of the opening because he was a little bit weaker, that he would then be able to fight his way back. And when the person who'd been taught to memorize things got to the mid game, and it just got to one of these many thousands of combinations that eventually you just cannot memorize, their principles weren't as strong, and Josh would slowly chip away at them and beat them. So that's one bit of info we need to understand this. The second bit of info here is that we need to understand this conversation is a theory about how people learn. And this is a theory about the difference between fixed versus growth mindsets. So this comes to work by Carol Dweck, who's a researcher. And fundamentally, her research shows that there are two different types of mindsets: fixed mindsets versus growth mindsets. So a fixed mindset is essentially someone who believes that, and we would probably all fit somewhere along a spectrum between one or the other, but a fixed mindset would be a belief that we all have fundamental skills and talents, and that these can't, to a large degree, be developed over time. So then this would be characterized by language such as, I'm not good at maths, or I'm really good at maths, or I'm not a good runner, or I'm a great runner. Versus a growth mindset, which fundamentally believes that if you put in hard work, that you can develop any skill or any talent to a really substantial degree. And so that would be characterized by language such as, I'm not currently good at maths. Notice the difference? Currently good. Or, I've worked really hard to get good at maths. See the difference here in the language? And so Josh then begins to relate back that there's the difference in mindset, because someone who has a fixed mindset might, for example, show some really early talent in chess, get picked up by a good coach and taught a good opening gambit, a good array of opening moves, and then begin to beat lots of other children at their own school because they've got a little bit of talent to begin with, they've been taught these fairly potent opening arrangements, they're mismatched against these other students, they're beating them. But what will eventually happen is that because it's got this strange combination of fixed mindset plus this opening array of moves that hasn't taught the principles in something, that when eventually, because everyone eventually loses, right, and comes up against challenges, people who've been taught by this method don't know how to adapt to losses, don't know how to face that challenge. So what would happen is young chess, essentially prodigies who were really, really talented but brought up through this method, would start to face stronger players like Josh. They would lose, and then they wouldn't know how to deal with it, wouldn't know how to adapt from there. Whereas a player who'd been brought up to understand the principles and might also have a growth mindset, if we learn more and more of these principles, I might suffer some setbacks now, I might lose the odd game now, but I'm building more and more of these principles and getting stronger and stronger, would eventually be able to deal with those losses better and adapt better to them. So what does this mean for water-sensitive urban design? I know that was a really, really, really long setup to this episode, but what this got me thinking about is about how we set objectives for water-sensitive urban design. So in southeast Queensland, where I live, most of what we term water-sensitive urban design, first up, it's really our first attempt at sustainable stormwater management, and water-sensitive urban design in its broadest sense can also include livability and amenity and urban cooling and microclimates and all this other cool stuff. But our first attempts to implement water-sensitive urban design have firstly been in sustainable stormwater management, so I'm going to say that from now on. Our first attempts at sustainable stormwater management have been driven by policies such as stormwater pollutant load reductions. And something that I've picked up just generally through our planning system of how we try and incentivize this, how we try and drive this, is this desire to try and simplify things as much as possible. For example, through deemed to comply solutions. So the objectives themselves are really simple. It's like reduce sediment, nitrogen, phosphorus, and gross pollutants by 80, I think I said nitrogen second, so that would be 80, 45, 60, and 90% respectively. And here's a really simple modeling tool like Music to do this, which by the way just spits out that everything needs a bioretention system on it, and you can go and do that. But by the way, if that's too much work, here's a deemed to comply solution where you just build a bioretention system anyway. So it's really, really simple system. So if you can get good at that system, you can really quickly start to, pop out developments, and you can win some work and you can get some jobs. This is beginning to sound a little bit like the chess prodigy, or the chess player, right, who shows a little bit of initial talent, wins a few games, gets taught a little, some opening moves, some opening gambits to get some initial wins, but then doesn't know where to go from there. And so I think there might be a fundamental problem here that we can pick up from Josh's thoughts. Because if it's a problem for a chess player to learn these initial opening moves but not the fundamental underlying principles of like, hey, why are we actually doing this? Then they're going to, say if they're a consultant, right, and they're winning some work, so they get some clients, maybe they've got a couple of people working for them, and they've done this work that complies with the objectives, then they start to get good at that, and they have this work on the line, they have people relying on them. Suddenly there's pressure that they need to keep doing it and keep getting stuff right. But the problem here is that if people started to get this success out of this really simplistic approach, as soon as things get complex, as soon as there's any reason to step outside the box, that's a real threat, because they haven't had a chance to practice it, haven't had a chance to embed the principles in the same way that Josh embedded the principles of the mid-game and the end-game into his chess. They haven't had a chance to embed that. So any situation that brings in more complexity is a real threat to them. It's a real threat to their business, because if they get it wrong, if they get beaten, then where do you go from that? It's like, ooh, it's a real threat to the who I am. So there's no incentive to do that. I'm suddenly a little bit concerned that our approach to, our good-natured approach to trying to be like, let's simplify things, let's make really simple objectives so that everyone can do it, might actually be setting us up for a situation where we lock ourselves into this situation where most of the people doing this work are actually disincentivized to ever step outside the box. And I wonder, despite how obvious it sounds to try and make objectives really simple, make things easy for people to get through, whether it's actually shooting ourselves in the foot in the long term. So there's something to chew on. And something to add to that is, of course, I've talked about this through a stormwater perspective, but this is actually embedded further into our planning system. There's a broader drive through everything that we do planning-wise for simplicity. Keep it simple, nice simple codes, quite nice elegant codes. Make the planning system as smooth and as possible for everything to get through. Fast-track development. The problem here is just the more we do that, the more simplicity is built in there, the more that there is this risk that as soon as that it doesn't match up with the complexity of the real world, it doesn't match up with the complexity of the mid-game and the end game, because the real world, just like a chess game, is infinitely complex. It is so incredibly complex that our simplifications just can't deal with it. So we set ourselves up, we embed ourselves to begin to get some success in this simple world, and then, because we're people and don't like to be shown up to be maybe not quite as good as we all thought we were, it's really scary to step outside that and actually admit, hey, you know what? This is not complex enough. And I think this might be a fundamental problem with our planning system and with this desire to simplify everything. And that's it. Chew on that. Thank you for tuning into this episode. Please let me know what you thought of that. Did that make sense? I hope it did. Sometimes these things are clearer in my mind, and when I try and explain them on camera, I wonder whether I've got a good point across. So, let me know what you thought of that episode. Did that make sense? I want to know. There's a few ways you can find us. You can find us at ideanthro.com. There's a contact us page. You can hit us up that way. You can also find the videos on YouTube. You can find them on Facebook, and I've started posting this to LinkedIn. So there's a bunch of ways to get in touch. Thank you for watching. Thank you to Josh Waitzkin for a really, really, really insightful book. It is probably my favorite book in the world. Have a good time. See ya.